The excitement of a new apartment quickly turned to dread as strange noises began to invade the silence of the building. At first, it was subtle, creaks, whispers, the occasional flicker of lights. But soon, it grew impossible to ignore. The whispers became clearer, and at night, the walls seemed to breathe, exhaling words that called her name. She tried to dismiss it, but as the days passed, it was undeniable. The apartment was alive. Then, she met a mysterious neighbor who warned her, "Leave before it's too late." But it was already too late. Now, the whispers are louder, more insistent, and the building's secrets are closing in around her, waiting to be uncovered. The first time I moved into my new apartment, I was excited, eager to start fresh in a new city. It was an exciting chapter, just me, my thoughts, and the promise of new beginnings. The apartment was everything I had hoped for, spacious, modern, and quiet, tucked into a calm neighborhood, far from the chaos of city life. But like all places that seemed too good to be true, something about it felt off, like an invisible weight pressing on my chest every time I entered. It was subtle at first. There were the usual sounds of apartment living, the faint hum of appliances, the creaking of the building settling. But after a few days, I started noticing things that seemed out of place. I thought I was just getting used to a new environment, but the oddities began to pile up, each one stacking on top of the other like bricks in a wall, until I couldn't ignore them any longer. The first night I heard the whispers, I chalked it up to my imagination. I was still getting used to the sounds of my new surroundings, and maybe my neighbors were just talking too loudly through the walls. But then it kept happening, night after night. Soft, barely perceptible murmurs, just loud enough to make me strain my ears and try to make sense of them. The sounds didn't come from one direction, but from multiple places at once, as though the walls themselves were alive, whispering to each other, hiding secrets I wasn't meant to hear. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. People in apartments talk to each other all the time, and maybe the acoustics of the building made sounds travel more than they should. But the whispers grew more frequent and more distinct as the days passed. They began to feel deliberate, like they were trying to get my attention, beckoning me into something I didn't understand. The whispers didn't stop when I put on headphones or tried to drown them out with music. They were still there, lingering, crawling beneath the sound of whatever I was playing. I remember the first time I stood up to investigate. I was lying in bed one night, unable to sleep as usual, when I heard it, clearer this time, coming from the wall next to my bed. It was almost like the walls were breathing, a soft exhale followed by a word, then another breath. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure whether I was hearing things or if someone, was actually there, on the other side of the wall, speaking to me. The thought terrified me, but curiosity tugged at me like a magnetic force. I got up slowly, my legs shaky, and pressed my ear against the wall. Nothing. Just the sound of silence, my own breath echoing in the quiet. But when I pulled away, it came again. A soft whisper, almost like a voice calling my name. I backed away from the wall, my pulse racing. No one had been there. No one could have been. I tried to ignore it. After all, I had just moved in. Maybe the building was settling. Maybe I was just hearing things. But every night, without fail, it happened again. I'd hear the whispers at odd hours, sometimes just a few words, sometimes whole sentences, sometimes even soft laughter. And the most unsettling part? It didn't sound like it came from anyone in particular. It was as if the entire building was alive, and the walls were trying to communicate with me. I tried to tell myself I was just overtired or that the sounds were simply a product of living in an old building. But it wasn't just the sounds. There was something else about the atmosphere of the apartment that made me feel uneasy. A heaviness, like something was watching me, always just out of sight. I would walk through the hallways and get the distinct feeling that someone was behind me, but when I turned, no one would be there. Sometimes I'd find my lights flickering for no reason, even though I hadn't touched the switches. It was as though the building was alive, shifting in ways that I couldn't understand. But it wasn't until I met my neighbor that the real fear began to take root. I hadn't spoken to anyone in the building other than a few polite greetings when I moved in, but one day as I was walking to my car, I saw someone standing in the hallway, an older woman with wide, vacant eyes and a blank expression. She was staring at me, not saying a word. She wasn't moving, just standing there. It was an odd moment, like she was waiting for me to acknowledge her, but I didn't know what to say, so I kept walking. The next day, I ran into her again, but this time, she spoke to me. Her voice was soft, like a whisper, but there was an edge to it, a kind of knowing quality that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You hear them too, don't you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just nodded. Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You're not crazy," she whispered. "But you need to leave." I remember feeling both terrified and confused. Who was this woman? Why did she seem so certain of something I didn't understand? I told myself that she was just an eccentric neighbor, but deep down, a knot of dread formed in my stomach. Over the next few days, I tried to find out more about her. I asked a couple of neighbors, but no one seemed to know her well. They all described her the same way: quiet, reclusive, and strange. The more I learned, the more unsettling it became. No one knew how long she had lived there, or if she even had a family. In fact, it seemed like she didn't exist in the same way the rest of us did. She moved through the building like a ghost, fading into the shadows whenever anyone tried to approach her. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were coming from her apartment, but every time I went by, the door was closed and locked, and the silence inside felt thick, almost suffocating. I began to hear things in the hallways late at night, footsteps that weren't mine, doors opening and closing with no one there. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming. I had the distinct sense that something was behind me, even when I was alone in my apartment. Something was closing in, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't. One evening, I decided I had had enough. I had to confront the source of the whispers, find out who or what was on the other side of the walls. With trembling hands, I grabbed a flashlight and knocked on the woman's door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her vacant eyes staring at me. She didn't say a word, but the look on her face was enough. She knew why I had come. "You should leave," she repeated softly, but this time, it wasn't a warning, it was a command. "The building doesn't want you here." Before I could say anything else, the door slammed shut in my face, and the whispers started again, louder now, more frantic. I pressed my ear to the wall, but this time, I didn't hear anything. Nothing at all. The silence was deafening. And in that silence, I understood. The whispers weren't coming from anyone else. They were coming from the building itself, or something inside it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of the building, the creaks and groans of the walls, the faint, distant whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing hour. But no matter how hard I tried to understand it, one thing was clear: the apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was a living thing, breathing and shifting, holding secrets I was never meant to uncover. And as I lay there, unable to escape the weight of the darkness pressing in around me, I realized something else. My neighbors weren't the ones I should fear. It was the walls. The ones that had been watching me all along. The second I moved in, I felt the weight of the apartment building settle on me like an oppressive cloud, thick and suffocating. My new home, a quiet place in a seemingly peaceful neighborhood, quickly became the setting for something I couldn't comprehend. My first few days were filled with the usual adjustment, unpacking boxes, settling in, and attempting to make the space feel like my own. But soon enough, the feeling that something was off crept in, like a slow tide, washing over me and sinking deep into my thoughts. It started small. At first, I thought it was the usual settling noises an old building makes: creaks in the floorboards, pipes groaning under the pressure, the occasional hum of an appliance. I could dismiss all of that, but it was the quiet things, the things I couldn't quite put my finger on, that made the apartment feel strange. The soft noises at night, just beyond my reach. The feeling that I wasn't truly alone, even when I was. It wasn't until I heard it for the first time that the fear truly took hold. It was the middle of the night, and I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep after a long day. The wind outside was blowing hard, rattling the windows, but there was something else too, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. It wasn't the wind, And it certainly wasn't any of the usual noises from the building. No, this was something different. It was quiet at first, barely audible, but it seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the walls were trying to communicate with me. My heart rate quickened as I strained my ears to catch the words, but I couldn't make them out. I thought I was imagining things, that perhaps I was just tired, but the whispers persisted. The next night, the whispers came again, only this time, they were louder, clearer. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice, someone speaking in hushed tones, just out of reach, as if they were just behind the wall, on the other side of the room. It wasn't a sound that came from the hallway or the neighbors' apartments. No, this was coming from inside the walls, from somewhere deep in the structure of the building. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, the reality of what I was hearing crept into my thoughts like a shadow. I tried to tell myself that it was just the house settling. I tried to convince myself that it was just the sound of the wind moving through the cracks in the walls, or maybe the pipes expanding and contracting with the changing temperature. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. The whispers felt deliberate. They seemed to be trying to say something, to get my attention. Every night, they grew louder, more insistent, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me, urging me to listen, to hear the message they carried. On the third night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and the only way to understand it was to confront it directly. I stood up from my bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way to the wall. My fingers brushed against the cool surface of the plaster, and for a moment I just stood there, waiting, listening. And then I heard it again, the whispers, this time unmistakable, as though someone was speaking just a few feet away behind the wall. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed my ear to the cold surface, desperate to hear the words. But there was nothing. Silence. I pulled away, confused and terrified. I wasn't imagining this, I couldn't have been. The whispers had been real, I'd heard them, clear as day, yet there was no one there. No one could be there. I backed away from the wall, my legs weak and trembling, my mind racing with possibilities, none of which I could make sense of. The next day, I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe it had just been the wind, or the sound of someone else's television bleeding through the walls. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. At least, that's what I told myself. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more I found myself listening for it, hoping for a hint, a clue, something to explain the unease gnawing at me. And then it happened again. The next night as I lay in bed, the whispers came back, louder this time, clearer. The voice seemed to say something I couldn't quite understand, but this time, it was different. It felt urgent, like the voice was calling out to me, pleading with me to listen, to understand. The words were still muffled, but there was a sense of desperation in the sound, a growing intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. The apartment, the walls, something was alive, and it was speaking to me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the neighbors, I thought. Maybe they were talking through the walls. But no, it didn't sound like normal conversation. It wasn't coming from a single direction, but from everywhere, all around me. It felt like the whole building was alive, whispering to each other, sharing secrets behind the plaster and wood. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being trapped, of being surrounded by something I couldn't see, was overwhelming. That was when I decided to take action. I couldn't just live in fear of what I didn't understand. I had to know what was happening. So, one evening, when the whispers had grown particularly loud, I stood up and walked toward the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. I was going to find the source of the noise, no matter what it took. As I moved through the apartment, I heard something new, a faint rustling sound coming from the other side of the wall. My hand froze on the doorknob as I realized that this wasn't just a random sound. It was deliberate, like someone was moving on the other side, listening, waiting. My mind raced, and for a moment, I considered backing out, but I couldn't. I had to know. I pressed my ear to the wall once more, and this time, it wasn't just a whisper. The sound was clearer now, and I could make out distinct words. "Help me," a voice whispered, soft but clear, the tone desperate, pleading. Please help me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. The voice, it sounded human, but there was something wrong about it. Something off. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a cry from the walls, from somewhere deep within the apartment, from a place I couldn't see. I stumbled back from the wall, my heart racing, blood pounding in my ears. I wasn't sure what I had just heard, but it felt wrong. It felt like it wasn't just a sound, but a message. A warning. But from who? And why now? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something I wasn't prepared for, something that I couldn't escape. As I stood there, trembling, the whispers came again, this time louder and more insistent. But it wasn't just one voice anymore. No, now there were multiple voices, faint, distant, overlapping, like they were calling to me from all directions. You shouldn't be here, one voice hissed. Leave while you still can, another warned. Help us, a third begged. The words twisted in my mind, pulling me deeper into the web of confusion and fear. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I couldn't ignore it. The building wasn't just a building anymore. It was something else, something alive, something waiting. And no matter how hard I tried to leave it behind, I knew that the walls would never let me forget. The whispers would never stop. They had found me, and they weren't going to let me go. I had been living in the apartment for a few weeks when I first saw him. It wasn't a grand or dramatic entrance. No doors slamming open or ominous shadows creeping around corners. He was just there, standing in the hallway, staring at me from the end of the corridor. It was an ordinary evening, and I was returning home after a long day at work. The hallway lights flickered overhead as I walked, the soft buzz of the fluorescent lighting echoing in the quiet. I didn't think much of it at first. People pass through hallways all the time, right? But as I got closer to my door, something felt off. The man was tall, dressed in a dark, nondescript jacket, with dark, sunken eyes that seemed to look right through me. He wasn't staring at me in the way that someone might glance at a stranger in passing. No, it was different. He was watching me intensely, almost as if he were waiting for something. There was no expression on his face, just emptiness. I felt a chill run through me, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to get away from him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, and as much as I wanted to walk past him without acknowledging his presence, I found myself frozen, caught in his gaze. "Good evening," I managed to say, trying to break the silence. The words came out more as a nervous murmur than anything else. I wasn't sure why I felt the need to speak to him. Maybe it was to ease my own anxiety, or maybe I was trying to convince myself that this was just a normal, everyday encounter. But the man didn't respond. He didn't even move. His eyes remained fixed on me as if he were sizing me up, measuring something that I couldn't quite understand. The seconds stretched on, becoming unbearable. I wanted to run, to slam my door and lock myself in, but I couldn't make myself do it. Instead, I forced myself to look away, pretending to fumble with my keys as I opened the door. The moment I stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind me, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man was still there, I thought. I couldn't be sure, but I was certain I could feel his presence lingering just beyond my door. It was an unsettling thought, but I couldn't ignore it. The next few days passed in a blur of discomfort. I tried to push the memory of the man out of my mind, but it lingered in the background like a dark cloud, always there, always waiting. Every time I passed the hallway, I found myself glancing nervously at the end, half expecting to see him standing there again. But he never was. Still, the unease continued to grow. I started hearing strange sounds in the building, muffled footsteps outside my door, soft knocking that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But when I opened the door, no one was there. At night, I could hear faint scratching noises, as if something was trying to claw its way through the walls, just beneath the surface. The building was old, but it wasn't that old. The sounds were too unnatural to ignore. They felt deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know who that man was, why he was staring at me in the hallway. It wasn't normal to feel so uncomfortable in your own home, so I decided to ask the neighbors about him. The building was small, only a few units on each floor, so it didn't take long before I found someone who knew him. Or at least knew of him. I ran into an older woman who lived across the hall from me, someone I'd seen only a few times before. She was in her late 60s, with a kind smile and an air of someone who had seen a lot in life. I wasn't sure if she'd know anything, but I had to try. I asked her if she knew the man I had seen in the hallway a few days ago, the one who never spoke, just stood there staring. Her face immediately darkened, her lips pressing into a tight line as she glanced around, almost as though she were afraid someone might hear. "Stay away from him," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "He's been here for a long time. Longer than anyone else." She paused, looking at me with a mixture of pity and something else. Fear, maybe? I wasn't sure. "He's not who you think he is. Don't let him get too close." I was confused. What did she mean by that? The man had seemed so ordinary, so harmless, just standing there in the hallway. "But he didn't say anything," I replied, trying to piece together what she meant. "He didn't do anything. Why should I stay away from him?" The woman shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to find the right words. "It's hard to explain. There's something about him, something you won't understand until you see it for yourself." She looked around once more, as if checking for anyone who might be listening. "Just trust me. Stay away from him and don't make eye contact." Her words only deepened the mystery, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I wasn't being told. Who was this man? Why had he been in the building for so long? What was it about him that made people so afraid? The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The whispers in the walls seemed to grow louder, more urgent. I could hear them clearer now, as though they were trying to warn me about something about him. It was almost as if the building itself was alive, trying to tell me something, but I couldn't decipher the message. All I knew was that the presence of the man, the one who never spoke, who just watched, was becoming harder and harder to ignore. The next time I saw him in the hallway, I was prepared. I wasn't going to just look away this time. I wasn't going to be so easily intimidated. But as I walked toward him, something felt off. His eyes weren't just empty, they were filled with something dark, something ancient, something that seemed to be watching me in a way that sent a jolt of panic straight through my veins. My feet slowed, my breath catching in my throat as I walked past him. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, and as I passed him, I could feel his gaze burning into the back of my head, like a constant presence, always there, always following. And for a moment, I wondered if he knew something I didn't. If he was waiting for me to realize something important. But I didn't. I kept walking, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. And as I reached my door, I heard the softest whisper from behind me. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. My hand was still on the doorknob, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. My first instinct was to turn around, to confront him, but something told me not to. Something told me that if I turned around, I might never leave the hallway. So, I opened the door as quickly as I could, stepping inside and slamming it shut behind me. My pulse raced, and I could feel my hands trembling as I locked the door. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know who that man was or why he terrified me so much. But one thing was certain, whatever he was waiting for, it had only just begun. And I was already too deep to escape. The days following that encounter felt like a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was holding its breath, waiting for something. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with an oppressive energy I couldn't ignore. Every step I took in my apartment seemed to echo louder than it should, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the silence. I began to question whether I was just imagining things, whether the stress of moving into a new place and settling into a new life was taking a toll on me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just in my head. The building was changing, or maybe it had always been this way, and I was only now starting to see it for what it really was. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the man in the hallway. It was something far darker, something that ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. I began hearing things that I couldn't explain. It started with the lights. At first, I thought it was just a faulty bulb or a problem with the electrical wiring, but the flickering wasn't just random. It happened at the same time every night, right around midnight, when the rest of the building seemed to fall into a deep, heavy silence. The lights in my apartment would flicker once, twice, then go out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I'd fumble for my phone, using the screen to guide me to the light switch, but no matter how many times I tried, the lights wouldn't come back on. The darkness felt thick, like it was pressing in around me, suffocating me with its weight. I would stand there, in the pitch-black room, feeling the walls closing in, my mind racing with all sorts of worst-case scenarios. Was there something in the dark? Was there something waiting in the shadows? The flickering lights didn't stop at my apartment. I began noticing the same thing happening in the hallways. It was subtle at first, just a faint stutter of the overhead lights, but soon, it became more pronounced. The flickering wasn't random, it seemed to follow me. I could walk down the hallway and watch the lights above me flicker and go out as I passed beneath them. It was as if the building itself was reacting to my presence, responding to something that I couldn't see, couldn't understand. I tried to ignore it at first, but it grew harder and harder to dismiss. The sensation that something was wrong, that something was moving just beyond the edges of my perception, began to consume me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was alive, that it was watching me, waiting for me to unravel its secrets. I started researching the history of the building, hoping to find some explanation, something that would make sense of what was happening. But the more I dug, the more I found nothing. The building's past was a blur, a list of owners who came and went, and no one seemed to remember anything of significance. It was as if the building itself had no history, no story. But I didn't stop looking. I couldn't. I needed to know what was happening, why I was feeling so wrong every time I stepped foot in that place. The lights flickered again one night, but this time, I wasn't alone. I had a friend over, someone I had known for years, someone who didn't know about the strange occurrences I had been experiencing. We were sitting in the living room, chatting about work and life, trying to keep the conversation light and normal. But as the clock struck midnight, the lights went out. It wasn't the usual flicker. This time, the room was plunged into complete darkness, and for the first time, I wasn't alone in it. I heard my friend's voice, low and concerned, but I could hear the edge of fear in it too. What the hell? Why did the lights go out? I scrambled to find my phone, my hands shaking, trying to light up the room. I could feel the tension in the air, the heavy weight of something that didn't belong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker, like they were closing in on us. I could hear my friend's breathing, quick and shallow, as he scanned the room with his phone's flashlight. But the more I looked around, the more I felt something was wrong. I couldn't place it. The walls felt too close. The air felt thick as if it were holding something back. The shadows didn't move the way they should. They seemed to shift, bending unnaturally, as if they were alive, growing longer, stretching towards us. "Let's just get out of here," my friend said, his voice tight with panic. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something was holding me there, keeping me rooted to the spot, as though the very building was preventing me from leaving. The flickering lights came back on, briefly, and in that instant I saw something. It was a fleeting glimpse, just a shadow in the corner of the room, but I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. A figure, tall, dark, and indistinct, but it was there, standing just beyond the reach of the light, watching us. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to my friend, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see that?" He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah. I saw it too." We didn't say anything after that. We didn't need to. The fear was palpable, hanging in the air like smoke. My friend quickly stood up, grabbing his jacket, and without another word, we both hurried to the door. But the hallway wasn't any better. The lights in the hall flickered on and off as we made our way out of the apartment, and the heavy silence of the building seemed to press in around us. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the building itself was alive, watching, waiting. I hadn't felt truly afraid until that moment. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, settled deep in my bones, and I couldn't shake it. My friend and I stood outside in the cool night air, both of us silently trying to shake off the terror that clung to us like a second skin. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to return to that place, where the shadows were too dark, where the walls seemed to be alive, whispering, moving. But I had no choice. I couldn't leave. I had nowhere else to go. I had to return to the apartment, to face whatever was haunting me, to confront the dark presence that had taken root in the very building itself. The moment I stepped back inside, I felt it again. The heaviness in the air, the oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. The silence was suffocating, but this time, it wasn't just the silence of an old building. It felt wrong, like there was something hiding in the dark corners, something waiting for me to make a mistake, to let my guard down. And I felt like I was teetering on the edge, just one step away from falling into the unknown. I walked through the apartment, my steps slow and measured, trying to keep calm, trying to reassure myself that it was just my imagination. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I felt the darkness pressing in around me. The whispers were louder now, not from the walls, but from the very air itself. They were no longer just whispers. They were voices, distinct, urging me to listen, to understand. I wasn't alone in this building. I never had been. There were things here, and they were waiting. Waiting for me to figure out what they wanted. Waiting for me to unlock the door to whatever nightmare had been lurking just beneath the surface all along. It had been a few days since that terrifying encounter, and I tried my best to pretend everything was fine, to convince myself that what had happened was just an anomaly, a trick of the mind. But nothing was fine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me through the halls of the apartment building. The feeling was constant, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. It wasn't just the flickering lights anymore, or the whispers that came from the walls late at night. It was deeper than that, something more profound, something far more unsettling. I tried to distract myself, to go about my days as if everything were normal. I kept busy with work, spent time out of the apartment, and even invited friends over, hoping to fill the silence with noise, to drown out the oppressive feeling that clung to me whenever I was alone. But it didn't work. The fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me, like they were pressing against me, watching, waiting for something. It wasn't long before I started seeing things. At first, it was subtle, just brief flashes in the corner of my vision. A shadow passing too quickly for me to register, a fleeting figure at the edge of my peripheral. But then the flashes started to grow more frequent, more intense. I would catch glimpses of someone standing in the hallway, or in the reflection of the bathroom mirror. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. My heart would race, my breath quicken, and I would turn away, convincing myself that it was just my imagination running wild. The most disturbing thing was the feeling of being followed. It was like someone was always just behind me, never quite visible but always present, always lurking. I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, the hallway would be empty. There were times when I would get out of bed in the middle of the night to grab a glass of water, and I would feel the weight of someone's gaze on me, the sense that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching me from the shadows. And when I looked, I saw nothing. But I felt it, deep in my bones, that crawling sensation of being observed, of being hunted. I started to lose track of time. The days began to blur together, and I couldn't remember when the fear had started or when it had intensified. All I knew was that it had become a constant presence, a nagging weight on my mind that never went away. The building itself seemed to be part of it, as if it were alive, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with each passing day. I couldn't tell if the building was simply old, or if it had some dark energy of its own, some presence that had always been there, waiting for someone to uncover it. And then came the noises. I tried to ignore them at first, tried to convince myself that they were just the normal sounds of an old building settling, the pipes groaning or the wind rattling the windows. But these were different. These sounds weren't random, they were deliberate, purposeful. They were rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking on the walls, tapping out a pattern, a message. I would lie in bed at night, trying to ignore the sounds, trying to convince myself that they were just a figment of my imagination. But it didn't help. The knocking continued, always in a pattern, always at the same time each night. And no matter what I did, No matter how hard I tried to block it out, I couldn't escape it. The knocking would start soft, just a faint tap at first, barely audible. But as the minutes ticked by, the sound would grow louder, more insistent, until it felt like someone was pounding on the walls, demanding my attention. It was a sound that came from all directions, as if the building itself was alive, trying to communicate with me. The air would grow thick, heavy, and I could feel the temperature drop, as if the building was breathing, exhaling a cold, damp breath that filled the room. I would pull the covers over my head, trying to block out the noise, but it didn't help. The knocking would continue, rhythmic, relentless, as if it were coming from deep within the walls, from some unseen source. One night, I decided that I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what was causing the sounds. I couldn't live like this, always on edge, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next unsettling occurrence. So, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the hallway, determined to confront whatever was making those noises. My heart raced with each step, my pulse thundering in my ears as I moved through the darkened hallway. The flickering lights overhead seemed to follow me, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The air was thick, heavy with the same oppressive presence I had felt since the moment I moved in. I stopped in front of the door to the apartment next to mine, the one that I had never really paid attention to before. But now, standing in front of it, something about the door felt off. The wood was old, worn, and scratched in a way that didn't seem normal. I could hear the faintest sound coming from behind it, the softest whisper, like a voice, barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from the other side. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I pressed my ear to the door, listening intently. The whisper was clearer now, almost like a chant, words I couldn't understand, but they were there. A rhythmic pattern, like a prayer or a song, and it made my stomach turn. I knocked on the door, a hesitant tap at first, but then I found myself pounding on it, desperate for an answer. I needed to know what was behind it, what was causing the noise, what had been following me. The door creaked open, and I was met with darkness. There was no one there. The apartment inside was empty, barren, as though it had been abandoned long ago. But the whispering continued, and I could feel it vibrating through the walls, through the air around me. It was as if the building was alive, its very bones pulsing with something other, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the old furniture that was covered in dust and cobwebs. But something else caught my attention. In the far corner of the room, there was a mirror. It was cracked, the glass shattered in several places, but it still reflected the room in a distorted, unsettling way. As I walked closer, I saw someone, standing behind me in the reflection. My heart skipped a beat and I spun around, but there was no one there. I turned back to the mirror, my breath catching in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving in the corner of the glass, just at the edge of my vision. It was too fast to focus on, but I knew what I saw. I wasn't alone. The whispering grew louder, more frantic now, as though the voice was trying to warn me, to reach me through the cracks in the mirror. I backed away, my pulse racing, my thoughts scattered in 1,000 directions. The air around me felt thick, like I was suffocating, and every part of me screamed to leave, to get out, to run. But something kept me there, something was pulling me deeper into the apartment, deeper into the mystery of the building. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and as I turned to leave, I heard the voice again, this time, clear as day. "You shouldn't have come." It was a whisper, but it felt like a shout in my head, a command, a warning. And then everything went dark. When the lights came back on, I was no longer in the apartment. Or rather, I wasn't in the same place I had been moments before. I had no memory of what had happened after hearing that voice. The oppressive air around me, the whispering, the shadow in the mirror, it all blurred into something dark and incomprehensible. My head throbbed as I tried to focus, to piece together what had just occurred, but the more I tried to make sense of it, the more the details slipped through my fingers, like water. I was standing in the hallway now, outside my own door, but nothing felt real. The air was still thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. Everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. It was as if the apartment, the building itself, had changed while I had been lost in the darkness. I reached for the doorknob, my hands shaking. As I turned it, the door creaked open, revealing my apartment in its usual state, quiet, still, but somehow wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper now, and the silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. I stepped inside, but something about the place felt empty. Not in the way that an abandoned house feels empty, this was different. It felt as though the very space itself had been drained of life, as though the walls had absorbed something unseen. I walked through the apartment slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The sense of being followed, of being watched, was more intense than ever before. Every step I took felt like it was being observed, every breath I exhaled felt like it reverberated through the building, carrying my fear with it. I stopped in front of the living room window, the one that overlooked the courtyard below. The lights outside were dim, casting long shadows across the street. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even. But I could feel it, something was off. The night seemed too quiet, the street too still. The usual sounds of traffic and people walking outside were absent, replaced by an unnerving silence that stretched out into the distance. It was as though the world had stopped, frozen in place. I turned away from the window, feeling the pressure of the silence growing heavier, pressing down on me. I needed to leave, to get out of the apartment, but the thought of stepping back into the hallway, back into that place that had begun to feel like a prison, filled me with dread. I couldn't escape it. It felt like I was caught in some sort of loop, trapped in a place that wasn't entirely real, but wasn't entirely a dream either. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of something lurking just beyond my reach remained, as palpable as ever. I moved to the kitchen, hoping to distract myself. Maybe if I made something to eat, it would help calm my racing thoughts. I opened the fridge and pulled out a carton of milk, but when I turned back to the counter, I saw it. A shadow, just behind me, reflected in the darkened surface of the kitchen window. I whipped around, but the kitchen was empty, the room exactly as it had been moments before. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I just stood there, frozen, unable to move. The shadow in the window hadn't been a trick of the light. It had been a figure, standing just behind me. I hadn't imagined it. I could feel it, the weight of its presence, like it was just on the edge of my vision, waiting for me to turn around. But when I did, there was nothing. I slammed the refrigerator door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it was clear that something was wrong, something that I couldn't see, but could feel every moment I was in this place. I grabbed my coat and rushed out of the apartment, barely stopping to lock the door behind me. The hallway felt colder than usual, the air thick with the same oppressive presence that had followed me inside. I had to get out. I needed space. But as I descended the stairs, the feeling of being followed only grew stronger. The silence was deafening now, and every step I took seemed to echo in the hollow emptiness of the building. The stairwell was dimly lit, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering intermittently, casting unsettling shadows against the walls. The sense of unease gnawed at me, making my skin crawl, but I couldn't stop moving. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. When I reached the ground floor, I didn't pause to check the mail or linger by the front door. I rushed outside, gasping for fresh air, but the relief I expected never came. The street was just as empty as the building, the same unnatural quiet settling over everything. The silence felt suffocating, like the world had been muted, as though some force was pressing in, keeping everything still, keeping everything silent. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement, and the shadows seemed to grow, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. I could feel them, closing in on me, inching closer, and the air felt colder, the temperature dropping with each passing moment. I turned around, ready to head back into the building when I saw it, a figure, standing in the distance, in the middle of the street, just outside the reach of the light. The figure was tall, but it was hard to make out any other details. It was like the shadow itself had come to life, standing motionless in the dark, watching me. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I knew what it was. I felt it. The presence that had been following me, the one that had been haunting me in the apartment, it was here, out in the open now, standing in the street, waiting. I couldn't move. My feet felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the ground, as though the very air was holding me in place. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me, its dark silhouette outlined by the dim light of the street lamp. I could feel the weight of its gaze, a pressure so intense it made my head spin. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Vanished into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and ran back into the building, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where to go or what to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay out here. I couldn't face whatever that thing was, whatever it wanted from me, out in the open. I ran up the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell, and I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it quickly, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the key. I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. But the fear, the presence, it hadn't gone away. It was still there, waiting. I could feel it even in the quiet of my apartment. It was watching me just beyond the walls, just beyond the door. And no matter how hard I tried to shut it out, I knew I couldn't escape it. The building had claimed me, and now, it wasn't going to let me go. The apartment felt different now, in ways I couldn't quite articulate, but that I could feel down to my bones. There was no longer any sense of normalcy, no comfort in the space that I had once hoped would become my sanctuary. The walls seemed thinner, as though they could no longer hold back the whispers that filled the building. The shadows had become darker, deeper, almost as if they had weight to them. They weren't just reflections of light, they were tangible, living things, creeping and stretching across the floor and walls in ways that didn't make sense. The faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the sound of the wind against the windows, all of it had faded into the background, replaced by a new, unsettling quiet. But it wasn't the silence that bothered me. It was the feeling that something was waiting, that something was just around the corner, hidden in the places I couldn't reach. It was late one night when it started again, the knocking. But this time, it wasn't the slow, methodical tapping from within the walls that I had grown accustomed to. No, this was different. It was louder, more urgent, and it seemed to come from everywhere. It was as if the walls themselves had come alive, beating and shaking with every knock. My skin prickled as I sat frozen in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't just a noise, it felt like a message, something I was meant to hear but could never fully understand. The knocking came in patterns, rhythmic and precise, almost like a language, but it wasn't one that I could comprehend. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was easy to convince myself of that, after everything that had already happened. I had been under stress, hadn't I? I'd been dealing with the isolation of living alone in this strange, old building. My mind must have been playing tricks on me. But as the sound grew louder, as the walls seemed to shake with each violent knock, I couldn't deny it anymore. The building wasn't just settling, it was alive, and whatever had been hiding within it had finally made its presence known. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked cautiously to the door. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to get worse. I had to do something. The hallway was dark, the faint glow of the overhead light flickering in the distance. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped into the corridor, the sound of the knocking growing louder with every step I took. It was coming from below, from the apartment in the basement, the one that no one had ever spoken about. The one that no one ever went near. I had heard rumors about that apartment, whispers that it was abandoned, that it had been sealed off long ago, but I hadn't paid much attention to them. The building was old, after all, and there were always strange stories about places like this. But now, as I stood at the edge of the staircase that led down to the basement, I could hear the knocking clearly, as if it was coming from just beneath my feet. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't make out any figures in the darkness, but I could feel the weight of the building pressing in around me, suffocating me with its silence. I hesitated for a moment, my hand gripping the railing, my heart pounding in my chest. Something told me I shouldn't go down there. Something told me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know what was causing the sound, what was waiting for me in the darkness. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, the echoes of my footsteps mingling with the knocking that seemed to grow louder the closer I got. The basement was cold, colder than the rest of the building, and the air smelled damp, musty. I could barely see anything, the light from above not reaching far enough to illuminate the space. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, the wood groaning as I made my way down. The knocking was now unmistakable, clear and precise, like it was coming from the farthest corner of the room. The space was vast, a series of storage units and old, forgotten furniture that seemed to loom in the shadows. But what caught my eye was the door at the far end of the basement, an old wooden door, its surface warped with age, its hinges rusty from disuse. It was the only door in the basement that was closed, the others all left slightly ajar, as if they had been forgotten long ago. The knocking was coming from behind that door. I walked toward it slowly, my breath caught in my throat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My mind raced, but no coherent thoughts formed. I could only focus on the sound, on the rhythm of the knocks, which had somehow become more urgent, more desperate as I approached. I reached for the doorknob, and for a brief moment, I hesitated. The door seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive, as if it were breathing, waiting for me to touch it. The moment my hand made contact with the knob, the knocking stopped. It was as though the whole world held its breath, waiting for me to open the door. I turned the knob slowly, and as the door creaked open, I was hit with a rush of cold air, colder than I had expected. The basement was dark, but now, as I stepped inside, I could see faint traces of something that didn't belong. The room was cluttered with old furniture, piles of forgotten boxes, and stacks of magazines that hadn't been touched in years. But it wasn't the mess that caught my attention. It was the walls. The walls of the basement were covered in strange, faded markings, symbols I didn't recognize, scrawled in what looked like dark ink, smeared and faded with age. They seemed to form a pattern, a map of sorts, but it didn't make sense. It was chaotic, disjointed, like a jumbled collection of thoughts that didn't belong together. The knocking started again, louder this time, as if it were coming from the very heart of the room. But I couldn't find its source. I looked around frantically, my flashlight sweeping across the clutter, but the room was empty. There was nothing there, nothing except the strange markings on the walls, and the overwhelming sense that something was watching me. The air felt thick as though it was pressing in on me, suffocating me with its weight. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the far wall, hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out its shape, couldn't see its features, but I knew it was there, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step forward, trying to get a better look. But the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, slipping into the shadows like it was part of them, like it was one with the darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran back toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The door wasn't there anymore. The space that had once led to the basement stairwell was now just a wall, a solid, featureless surface. There was no way out. I was trapped. I pounded on the wall, screaming for help, but no sound escaped my lips. The knocking started again, but now it was louder, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. I could feel the space shrinking, the darkness pressing in from all sides, and the air was thick with something other, something that wasn't human, something that had been waiting in the shadows for far too long. I could feel it, its cold breath on my neck, its hands reaching out to drag me back into the darkness. And I knew in that moment that there was no escape. The building had claimed me, just as it had claimed everyone else who had come before me. It had been waiting, watching, and now it was time for me to join the rest of its lost souls, trapped forever, part of the building's dark, twisted legacy. The darkness around me felt suffocating, like it was swallowing me whole. I pressed my hands against the smooth wall, desperately searching for any sign of an exit, but the surface was cold and unyielding. The space had become impossibly small, the air thick with the sense of something ancient, something evil that had been waiting here far longer than I could comprehend. I could still hear the knocking, its rhythmic pounding coming from somewhere deep within the building, but now it was different. It wasn't just a noise, it felt like a pulse, a heartbeat, like the very walls were alive, vibrating with some force I couldn't understand. The knocking echoed in my ears, growing louder and louder until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me. My breath quickened, my chest tightening, and I could feel my heart racing as the panic began to claw at me, demanding to break free. I turned away from the wall, my mind reeling, but when I looked toward where the door had once been, I saw nothing. The blackness stretched on endlessly, swallowing the space around me, erasing any trace of the stairwell and the world I had known. There was no way out, no escape. The walls seemed to pulse with energy now, the markings I had noticed earlier shifting, moving as though they were alive, as though they were part of the building's twisted design. I staggered back, my legs weak beneath me, my stomach turning with fear. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't up to me anymore. The building had already claimed me, and there was no turning back. I had been foolish to think I could understand it, to believe that I could simply walk away from the terror that had begun to consume me. This place was not just old, it was something else, something darker, something that had fed on fear for generations. It had grown stronger with each passing year, with each new tenant who had moved in, unaware of the darkness that lay beneath the surface. The knocking started again, but this time it was different. It was coming from behind me, from the darkness that surrounded me, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against my back. The sound was deafening now, pounding like the drums of some ancient ritual. I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty, suffocating darkness, the walls closing in around me, and the feeling that something was moving just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, constricted, as though the very air was being squeezed from my lungs. I gasped for breath, but it was no use. I was suffocating, not just from the lack of oxygen, but from the overwhelming presence that filled the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, narrowing with every passing second, and I could hear the knocking growing louder, more urgent, as though whatever was behind the wall was trying to break through. I could feel it, its presence seeping through the cracks, filling the air with an oppressive force that weighed me down. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the walls, my fingers brushing over the strange markings that lined the surface. They were cold, unnaturally so, and as I traced the patterns, I felt a jolt of energy surge through me, a shock that made my entire body freeze. It was as though I had connected with something deep within the building, something ancient, something alive that had been waiting for me to touch it. I pulled my hand back, but the sensation lingered, a strange hum in my fingertips, like a low, vibrating frequency that I couldn't escape. I backed away from the wall, panic rising in my chest, but my retreat was cut short as I heard something else. A voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere deep within the darkness, a whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. I couldn't make out the words at first, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a command, something that demanded my attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, trying to make sense of the words that danced on the edge of my hearing. And then I heard it clearly. The voice whispered my name, its sound a twisted mockery of everything I had ever known. It was hollow, like an echo that had been stretched beyond recognition. "Come closer," it said, its voice laced with malice, dripping with an unnatural sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We've been waiting for you." I recoiled, my heart racing, and for a moment, I considered running. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The building had already taken me, and running would only make it worse. I turned away, my eyes scanning the room for some sign of escape, but there was none. The darkness stretched on endlessly, like a void that would consume me if I let it. The knocking was deafening now, pounding in my skull, rattling my bones. The walls were alive, alive with the sound, with the presence that I couldn't escape. I reached out, my hand trembling, and tried to grasp at the darkness, to push back against it, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean. The shadows twisted and writhed around my fingers, as though they were alive, as though they were feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every touch. I pulled my hand back, my breath ragged in my chest, and I stumbled backward into something cold and sharp, like a needle pricking my skin. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest, and when I turned around, I found myself face to face with a mirror. It wasn't the same mirror I had seen earlier, the one that had cracked and shattered in the abandoned apartment. This was different. The frame was dark and twisted, its edges jagged and sharp, like the teeth of some ancient predator. The glass was smooth, unmarked, and as I looked into it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was someone standing behind me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection of my own fear. But then I saw the figure more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a hood or a shroud, but I could feel its eyes, those cold, unfeeling eyes, piercing into me, into my very soul. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move.